Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to this week's Karaite Torah study with the World Alliance of Qara'im. I am Melech Ben Yaakov of the World Alliance of Qara'im, Hakham Melech Ben Yaakov of the World Alliance of Qara'im, and this week we're doing the Parsha, as usual. And this week's Parsha is the Vayakhel. And we'll do what we usually do. And what does that mean? That means that in the morning study, we do two studies usually. If I'm not going to synagogue, yes, I actually attend it's a very kind of mixed community. They're Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and one Karaite. So I actually, yes, I do need to be around my Jewish brothers and sisters, and I once in a while do go to this synagogue. But when I don't, I try to do two Torah studies, and when I do them in the morning study, we usually just read through the Torah portion without too much commentary. Although sometimes, one second, excuse me. Sorry about that. So, although sometimes I do do some commentary, but basically the goal of the morning Torah study is to read through the Parsha once, and in the afternoon Torah study we dig in more and we do a little bit more analysis. So, with that being said, we are in Parshat Vayakhel, and this is in Exodus chapter 35. Starts with the Shabbat, and as I mentioned before, the Shabbat is mentioned many times in the Torah, and as I always like to say, the more that a mitzvah is mentioned, the more important it is to the Torah. So obviously, based on that, the Shabbat is extremely important. I didn't go back and count exactly how many times, but we saw it in Exodus 20, in the giving of the 10 Commandments. It was already mentioned before. In the case of the manna, that the Israelites should not go out and gather the manna on Shabbat. It was mentioned afterwards in Exodus, I don't remember exactly where, but it was mentioned once again. And now it's mentioned here again at the beginning of Exodus 35. So this Parsha, we're going to be going from Exodus 35 basically through the middle of Exodus 38, which, believe it or not, almost brings us the end of Exodus. So we're going to be going through Exodus 38:20, so about halfway through Exodus chapter 38. I'll share the screen as I usually do so everyone can see, and we'll start reading through. I try to read as best I can in a way that's loyal to what many researchers think is what biblical Hebrew sounded like, although nobody knows for sure, and there's already always controversy, but I do my best. And as I've mentioned now for the past couple of weeks, one of the things I'm trying to do lately in improving this is trying to make a distinction between the patach and the kamatz in my reading. So the kamatz is the little T-looking vowel. There we go. And the patach is this guy over here, just a straight line. So I'm trying to give the kamatz more of an ah sound and the patach more of an ah sound. So bear with me as I try to perfect that over the weeks. So here we are in Exodus 35. Let me share the screen a little bit differently. If anyone has any comments or has any questions, please feel free to stop me and ask those comments and questions. I really like an interactive study. I don't like to be just sitting here talking for hours. So I love comments. I love questions. And anyone who would like to join in that way, please do. The best way to do it is to follow the StreamYard link, and then you can actually be in the studio with me, and we can almost have like a group session. Okay, so let me stop the screen here. Let me share it differently. And I think I have to set it up like that. There we go. Okay, so now you should be able to see as I flip back and forth between the various tabs. And here we are in Exodus 35. And I'm going to be reading in Hebrew. Follow along in Hebrew if you can. If not, follow along in your native language or whatever language you wish, or both side by side is maybe one of the best choices. And here we go. We're in Exodus 35, chapter 35, verse 1. Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat bnei Israel vayomer alehem ela hadvarim asher siwa Yehovah. And I've mentioned I've been doing a lot of research lately, and I'm not convinced anymore that the pronunciation of the name is Yehovah. I think the Karaite who promotes that idea may have made some serious mistakes in his research and his logic, and more information about that in coming weeks. At any rate, La'asot Otam, verse 2. Sheshet Yomim Te'osev Mimil Lacha Bayom HaShve'i Ye Lachem Kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton LeYehovah Kol HaOseh Bo Milacha Yumot. Verse 3. Lo Tiva'aru Ish Michol Moshvotechem Biyom HaShabbat. So this is maybe the key Karaite verse in all of the Torah, but I'm not going to even stop on it or linger on it or talk about it. There's just too much to say about it. But there it is. That's Karaism in a nutshell, right? This has been a controversial verse in the way that the Karaites versus the Rabbinites have traditionally interpreted this. And hint, I don't agree with the usual Karaite interpretation. Okay, verse 4. Vayomer Moshe el kol adat bnei Israel lemor zeh hadavar asher tziwa Yehovah lemor kechu meitchem teruma leYehovah kol nadiv libo yavi eha et terumat Yehovah zahav וכסף וכסף ונחושת ותכלת וארגמן ותולעת שני ושש ועזים ואורות אלים מאדמים ואורות תחשים ועצי שתים. Verse 8. ושמן למאור ובשמים לשמן המשחה ולקטורת הסמים ואבני שוהם ואבני מילואים לאפוד ולחושן. So these just all of these things that are being listed here, right? So now Moses has spoken about building the tabernacle, or we've heard about what the tabernacle is supposed to be and look like and how it's supposed to be built. And now we're actually going to go ahead and do it, right? So that's what's going on in these next couple of chapters. But all of these materials, right, we've mentioned before. In fact, if I can bring this up for a second. We made a spreadsheet listing, oops, there we go, listing these materials and what they may or may not mean, right? So we have here Zahav, Kesef, Nechoshet, Chelet, Argaman, Tola'at Shani, Shesh, Izim, Orot Elim, Tachoshim, Shitim, Shemen, Bisamim, Shoham, Avni Miluim, and then all different types of stones, right? So so we've analyzed what each of these various materials are, and these are the same materials being mentioned again, right? We have the Zahav, Kesef, Nechoshet, Chelet, Argaman, Tola'at Shani, Shesh, Wa'izim, Orot Elim, Adamim, Orot Tahashim, Atzei Shitim. This is basically the same list as always. Shemen Lema'or, Besamin, Meshemen, Lemishchal, Ktor Tasamim, Avnei Shoham, Avnei Miluim, Le'efod Dachoshen, right? So it's that same list again that is now being collected and being being gathered for the building of the Mishkan. Okay, so we are now in verse 10. V'chol Hakham Melech bachem יבואו ויעשו את כל אשר ציווה יהוה, את המשכן, את אכלו, ואת מכסהו, את קירוסהו, ואת קירושהו, את בריחהו, את עמודהו, ואת אדוניו, את הארון, ואת בדהו, ואת hakaporet wa'et parochet hamasach. So we have the kaporet and the parochet. They should not be confused. The kaporet is the covering. That's the ark covering. Sometimes they translate it as the mercy seat, which I think is actually an incorrect translation. I think it just refers to a covering. And parochet is the veil or the screen or the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies from the rest of the Mishkan. Okay, verse 13. Et shulchan wa'et badaw wa'et kol kelau wa'et ehem hapanim. So this is the bread, the showbread table. Wa'et minorat ha ma'or wa'et keleha wa'et ne roteha wa'et shemen ha ma'or wa'et mizbah haktoret wa'et badaw wa'et shemen hamishcha وאת קטורת הצמים, ואת מוסך הפתח לפתח המשכון, verse 16, את מזבח עולו, ואת מחבר הנחושת, אשר לו, את בדאו, ואת כל כלה, ואת הקיר, ואת קנו. Okay, so these are the same things, the badav, the badim are the carrying poles, the vessels that are associated with it, etc. Verse 17, et qul'ay ha he hotzer, et amudao, wa et adoneha, wa et mosach sha'ar he hotzer, et itdot hamishkon, et itdot he hotzer, wa et metarehem. Verse 19, et bigdei ha'srod לשרת בקודש, את בגדי הקודש לאהרון הכהן, ואת בגדי בנו לכהן. Okay, so it's kind of a list of things that should be brought, or that will be prepared. Okay, verse 20, the people offer gifts. ויצאו כל עדת בני ישראל מלפני משה, ויבואו כל איש אשר נשאו ליבו וכל אשר נדבו רוחו אותו, הביאו את תרומת יהוה למלאכת אוהל מועד ולכל עבודתו לבגדי הקודש, ויבואו האנשים על הנשים כל נדיב לב הביאו חך ונזם וטבעת וחומז כל כלי זהב וכל איש אשר הניף תנופת זהב ליהוה. Verse 23, וכל איש אשר נמצא איתו תכלת וארגמן ותולעת שוני ושש ועזים ואורות אלים מאדמים ואורות תחשים הביאו, כל מרים תרומת כסף ונחושת הביאו את תרומת יהוה, וכל אשר נמצא איתו עצי שיטים וכל מלאכת העבודה הביאו. Verse 25, וכל אישה חכמת לב בידיה תבוא ויביאו מטווה את תכלת ואת הארגמן ואת תולעת השוני ואת השש. Verse 26, וכל הנשים אשר נשא ליבן אותנה בחוכמה תבוא את העזים. So this is the women are doing the sewing, right? Traditional roles. והנשיאים הביאו את אבני השוהם ואת אבני המילואים לאפוד ולחושן. And notice that the Avnei Shoham, which is usually translated as onyx, although that's certainly not for sure, right? If we look at our list here, Shoham, yeah, onyx, there are different possibilities. Onyx, cornelian, chrysoprase, so different types of stones, but it's always mentioned separately from the other stones. And why is that? Because it appears on the breastplate. Okay, it appears also in the stones of the Choshen Mishpat. Do I have it listed here? No, I don't have it listed twice. But it appears also on the not on the breastplate. What did I say? Yeah, on the shoulders of the ephod. Okay, so that's why it's listed separately, this Avnei Shoham. So this is referring to the shoulder pads, basically on the ephod. And over here, the Avnei Miluim, these are the filling stones or the setting stones that go into the Hoshen, the breastplate. Although no one is sure even if that is a breastplate. There are other ideas as well, including some people say it's a sack filled with different types of stones that are pulled out. And well, we won't get into it now. All right, verse 28. Wa'ed habosem wa'ed ha-shomen le-ma'or le-shemen hamishcha le-ketoret ha-samim kol ish wa isha asher nodav libam otam lehovi lechol milocha asher tziwa Yehovah le'asot biyad Moshe heviu b'nei Yisrael nidava le-Yehovah. Okay, so now we're up to verse 30. Tzalel and Oholiav. Wayomer Moshe el bnei Israel re'u qara Yehovah b'shem B'tzalel ben Uri ben Hur lemate Yehuda. And I always want to point out, so many things we gloss by or we don't pay attention to when we're reading the Torah. But this B'tzalel comes from a very well-known family already. Okay, he comes from he's the grandson of Hur. Hur is mentioned a number of times that we've seen already. For instance, if I can find it here for a second, in Exodus 17, let's bring it up in the English just to save a little bit of time. So in the battle with the Amalekites, right? We have this incident where Joshua goes out and fights the Amalekites, okay? But Moses goes up to the top of the hill with who? With Aaron, his brother, and with Hur. And Aaron and Hur, what do? They hold up Moses' hands, right? As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. So he sits on the stone. Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. So this guy Hur is holding up the hands of Moshe, okay, as Joshua and the army are out fighting the Amalekites, okay. So this is the same Hur whose grandson is B'tzalel, right? B'tzalel ben Uri ben Hur. Oops. Just look at one more thing. Oops, that's not what I have to do. Excuse me. Let me close this off. So his father, Uri, they did Ur, and who we got Uri. So we even have in Chronicles, in Second Chronicles, First Chronicles 2:20, we have the genealogy. So let's just take a look at that again, just to save time. I'll read in the English. So we have here Caleb, the son of Chetzron, and this is a different Caleb. This is not the Caleb bin Yefuna. There are a number of different Calebs. In fact, if I remember correctly, there are 3 different Calebs in the Tanakh and 2 different Yefunes. So it's okay. At any rate, Caleb son of Chetzron had children by his wife Azuba and by Yeriot. These were her sons Yesher, Shovav, and Ardon. When Azuba died, Caleb married Ephrat, who bore him Hur. Hur was the son of Uri. Hur was the father of Uri, and Uri was the father of B'tzalel. Okay, so here's the genealogy right there. Okay, and this is from the tribe of Judah. Right, these were Judahites. Okay, so at any rate, Lemate Yehuda, verse 31. V'yimale oto ruach Elohim b'chokhmah b'tvuna u'b'da'at u'b'chol milocha ולחשוב מחשבות לעשות בזהב ובכסף ובנחושת, verse 33, ובחרושת אבן למלאות ובחרושת עץ לעשות בכל מלאכת מחשבת ולהורות נתן בליבו הוא ואהוליאב ben Ahisamach leMateidan. So here's his assistant. This is Aholiav. Okay, so Aholiav is only mentioned a couple times. And always here in these various verses, starting in 31. So always only with connection to the building of the tabernacle. And his father Ahisamach. Let's take a look. So Ahisamach is only mentioned with respect to his son Aholiav, and nowhere else. So unlike Uri, who comes from an important family, unlike Bezalel, who comes from an important family, he's the grandson of Hur, right, who's a leader apparently in within the tribe of Yehuda. Then Oholiav, his assistant, is does not have the same ichus, shall we say, as Bezalel does. At any rate, 35. Milei otam chokhmat lev ve'asot kol melechet chorosh ve'hoshev ve'rokem ba'tchelet u'ba'orgaman u'b'tola'at ha'shani u'vashesh wa'oreh עושה כל מלאכה וחושבי מחשבות. Okay, that's the end of Exodus 35. Any comments? Any questions? Alrighty, went to verse 36. ועשה בצלאל ואחוליאב וכל איש חכם לב אשר נתן יהוה חוכמה ותבונה בחמה לדעת לעשות את כל מלאכת עבודת הקודש לכל אשר ציווה יהוה. Verse 2. ויקרא משה אל בצלאל ואת אחוליאב ואל כל איש חכם לב אשר נתן יהוה חוכמה בליבו כל אשר נשאו ליבו לקרבה אל המלאכה לעשות אותה. ויקחו מלפני משה את כל התרומה אשר הביאו בני ישראל למלאכת עבודת הקודש לעשות אותה, והם הביאו אליו עוד נדבה בבוקר. Verse 4. ויבואו כל החכמים עושים את כל מלאכת הקודש איש ממלאכתו אשר המה עושים. ויאמרו אל משה לאמור מרבים העם להביא מדי העבודה למלאכה אשר ציווה יהוה לעשות אותה. Verse 6. ויצא משה ויעבירו כל במחנה לאמור איש ואישה אל יעשו עוד מלאכה ולתרומת הקודש ויקולה העם מהביא והמלאכה הייתה דיין לכל המלאכה לעשות אותה ויותר. So they brought so much. The point here is that the Israelites were so excited or so generous in their donations that there was too much material, and Moshe had to tell them to stop. We also have an interesting grammatical point here, which maybe I should point out right now. In verse 6, ויצב משה ויעבירו כל במחנה לאמור איש ואישה אל יעשו עוד מלאכה לתרומת קודש ויקלה העם מהביא והמלאכה הייתה דיין לכל המלאכה לעשות אותם ויותר. So, one second. Let me just read this one more time. ויצב משה ויעבירו כל במחנה לאמור איש ואישה אל יעשו עוד מלאכה לתרומת הקודש ויקלה העם מהביא והמלאכה הייתה דיין לכל המלאכה לעשות אותה ויותר. So here we have the word מלאכה. Okay, המלאכה הייתה דיין לכל המלאכה לעשות אותה ויותר. So here we have the word מלאכה being used in two different ways. In the beginning of verse 7, it's being used to represent the materials that were brought for the work of the tabernacle. And here it's being used to represent actually the work of the tabernacle. And this is a common a grammatical construct that we see in the Torah, in biblical Hebrew, that a word is used to represent, I guess you could say, that which causes it or that which is associated with it, rather than meaning it itself, because it wouldn't make any sense to say that the work was enough for all the work to do it and more. What it really means is the material was enough for all of the work, or to do all the work and even more. Okay, so here the word milacha is being used to represent the material that's brought to do the milacha. Milacha means work, right? Or tasks. In this case, the building of the Mishkan, right? So here the word milacha is being used not to represent, it really means work, okay? But it's being used not to represent the word work, but to represent the material that is needed to do the work. So this has a specific grammatical name in English, but I don't remember it at this point. So I won't say it, but this is we see this a lot in biblical Hebrew, where a word is used to associate that which, or is associated with that which. What do you want? I'm right in the middle of the study. You're bothering me. No, not from here. Okay, so that which is associated with it, or that which causes it. Okay, so in this case, the milacha, okay, the material is what enables the doing of the work. But here the word milacha is used to represent that material, that which enables the actual doing of the work. Okay, and I think mistakes are often made by various commentators, so-called great commentators, that they don't understand that this grammatical construct in biblical Hebrew. Okay, and again, it has a specific grammatical name in English, which I don't remember offhand. No. Okay, verse 8. We're in verse 8. בעושי המלאכה את המשכן 10 יריעות 6 משזר ותכלת וארגמן ותולעת שני קרובים מעשה חשב עשה אותם. אורך היריעה 1.28 בעמה ורוחב 4 בעמה היריעה 1 מידה 1 לכל היריעות. Verse 10. ויחבר את 5 היריעות 1 אל 1 ו5 יריעות חיבר 1 אל 1. ויעש לולאות תכלת על שפת היריעה 1 מקצה במחברת כן עשה בשפת היריעה הקיצונה במחברת השנית 50 לולאות עשה ביריעה 1 ו50 לולאות עשה בקצה היריעה אשר במחברת השנית מקבילות הלולאות 1 אל 1. ויעש 50 קרסי זהב ויחבר את יריעות 1 אל 1 בקרסים ויהי המשכן 1. Verse 14. יעש יריעות עזים לאוהל על המשכן 12 יריעות עשה אותם. אורך היריעה 1 30 באמה ו4 אמות רוחב היריעה 1 מידה 1 ל12 יריעות. ויחבר את 5 היריעות לבד ואת 6 היריעות לבד. Verse 17. ויעש לולאות 50 על שפת היריעה צונה במחברת ו50 לולאות עשה על שפת היריעה החוברת השנית. Verse 18. ויעש קרסי נחושת 50 לחבר את האוהל להיות 1. Verse 19. ויעש מכסה לאוהל אורות אלין מאדמים והוא מכסה את אורות תחשים מלמעלה. Verse 20. ויעש את הקרשים למשכן עצי שיטים עומדים 10 אמות אורך הקורש ועמה וחצי אמה רוחב הקרש 1 ושתי ידות הקרש האחד, משו לעבוד אחד אל אחד, כן עשה לכל כרסי המשכן, ויעש את הקרשים למשכן 20 קרשים לפעת נגב תימנה, ו40 אדני כסף עשה תחת 20 הקרשים, 2 אדונים תחת הקרש האחד לשתי ידותיו, ושני אדונים תחת הקרש האחד לשתי ידותיו. Verse 25. ולסלע המשכן השנית לפעת צפון עשה 20 קרשים, ו40 אדניהם כסף, 2 אדונים תחת הקרש האחד, ושני אדונים תחת הקרש האחד. ולירכתי המשכן ימה עשה 6 קרשים, ושני קרשים עשה למקצועות המשכן בירכתיים. Verse 29. וחיו תחומים מלמטה, ויחדו יהיו תמים אל ראשו אל הטבעת האחד, כן עשה לשני המקצועות. Verse 30. וחיו 8 קרשים ואדניהם כסף, 16 אדונים, 2 אדונים תחת הקרש האחד. Verse 31. ויעש בריחי עצי שיטים 5 לקרשי צלע המשכן האחד, ו5 בריחים לקרשי צלע המשכן השנית, 5 בריחים לקרשי המשכן לירכתיים יומה, ויעש כל הבריח התיכון לברוח בתוך הקרשים מן הקצה אל הקצה. Verse 34. ועת הקרשים ציפה זהב, ועת טבעותם עשה זהב, בתים לבריחים ויצף את הבריחים זהב. Verse 35. ויעש את הפרוכת חילת וארגמן ותולעת שני, ושש משזר מעשה חושב עשה אותה קרובים. Verse 36. ויעש לה 4 עמודי שיטים, ויצפם זהב, והם זהב, ויצוק להם 4 אדני כסף. Verse 37. ויעש מסך לפתח האוהל חילת וארגמן ותולעת שני, ושש משזר ומעשה רוקם, ואת עמודיו 5, ואת והם וסיפה ראשיהם, והשוקיהם זהב, אדניהם 5 נחושת. Okay, so that's verse 36. Verse 37. I'm sorry, chapter 37, verse 1. יעש בצלאל את הארון עצי שיטים, ו200 וחצי ארכו, ועמה וחצי רוחבו, ועמה וחצי קומתו, ויצפהו זהב טהור מבית ומחוץ, ויעש לו זר זהב סביב, ויצוק לו 4 טבעות זהב על 4 פעמותיו, ושתי טבעות על צלעו האחד, ושתי טבעות על צלעו השנית. ויעש בדי עצי שיטים, ויצף אותם זהב, ויבא את הבדים בטבעות על צלעות הארון, לשאת את הארון, ויעש כפורת זהב טהור, ו200 וחצי אורכה, ועמה וחצי רוחבה, ויעש 2 כרובים זהב מקשה עשה אותם, ושני קצות הכפורת, כרוב אחד מקצה מזה, וכרוב אחד מקצה מזה, מן הכפורת עשה את הכרובים משני קצותיו, והיו הכרובים פורסי כנפיים למעלה, שוחחים ובכנפיהם על הכפורת, פניהם איש אל אחיו אל הכפורת היו פני הכרובים. Verse 10. ויעש את השולחן עצי שיטים, אמותיים אורכו, ועמו ורוחבו, ועמה וחצי, קומתו, ויצף אותו זהב טהור, ויעש לו זר זהב סביב. Verse 12, יעש לו מסגרת טופח סביב, ויעש זר זהב למסגרתו סביב. ויצוק לו 4 טבעות זהב, וייתן את הטבעות על 4 הפאות אשר ל4 רגליו. Verse 14, לעומת המסגרת היו הטבעות בתים לבדים לשאת את השולחן, ויעש את הבדים עצי שיטים, ויצף אותם זהב לשאת את השולחן, ויעש את הכלים אשר על השולחן, את קערותו, ואת כפותיו, ואת מניקותיו, ואת הכסבות אשר יוסח בהן זהב טהור. Verse 17, ויעש את המנורה זהב טהור, מקשה עשה את המנורה ירחה, וקנה גביעיה, כפתוריה, ופירחיה ממנה היו, ושישה קנים יוצאים מצידיה, 3 קני מנורה מצידה האחד, ו3 קני מנורה מצידה השני. This was described earlier. Again, all of these are fulfillments of what was described earlier, almost word for word. 3 גרעים משוקדים בקנה האחד, כפתור ופרח, ו3 גרעים משוקדים בקנה האחד, כפתור ופרח. כן, ל6 הקנים היוצאים מן המנורה, ובמנורה 4 גרעים משוקדים, כפתוריה ופרחיה, וכפתור תחת 2 קנים ממנה, וכפתור תחת 2 קנים ממנה, וכפתור תחת 2 קנים ממנה. This is the Torah often uses repetition to represent counting, right? So it repeats 3 times here. Okay? 6 הקנים היוצאים ממנה, כפתוריהם וקנותם ממנה היו כולה מקשה אחת זהב טהור, ויעש את נרותיה 7 ומלקחיה ומחטותיה זהב טהור, וכיכר זהב טהור עשה אותה, ואת כל כליה. Verse 25. ויעש את מזבח קטורת עצי שיטים, עמו אורכו, ועמו רחבו רבוע, ואמותיים קומתו, ממנו היו קרנותיו. ויצף אותו זהב טהור, את גגו ואת קירותיו סביב, ואת קרנותיו, ויעש לו זר זהב סביב, ושתי טבעות זהב עשה לו מתחת לזרו על 2 צלותיו, על 2 צידיו לבתים לבדים לשאת אותו בהם. ויעש את הבדים עצי שיטים, ויצף אותם זהב. ויעש את שמן המשחה קודש ואת קטורת הסמים טהור, מעשה רוקח. That's Exodus 37, and now we're going to up to 38:20, so about halfway through this chapter. Okay, verse 1. So in Exodus chapter 38, verse 1. ויעש את מזבח עורלה עצי שיטים 5 אמות אורכו ו5 אמות רוחבו, רבוע ו3 אמות קומתו, ויעש קרנותיו על 4 פנותיו, ממנו היו קרנותיו, ויצף אותו נחושת. ויעש את כל כלי המזבח, את הסירות ואת היועים ואת המזרקות ואת המזלגות ואת המחטות, כל כלו עשה נחושת, ויעש למזבח מחבר מעשה רשת נחושת תחת קרקובו מלמטה עד חציו, ויצוק 4 טבעות ב4 קצות למחבר הנחושת בתים לבדים, ויעש את הבדים עצי שיטים ויצף אותם נחושת, ויובא את הבדים בטבעות על צלעות המזבח לשאת אותו, והם נבוב לוחות עשה אותו. ויעש את הכיור נחושת ואת קנו נחושת במראות הצובעות אשר צבו פתח אוהל מועד. Verse 9. ויעש את הקוצר לפעת נרב תימנה כלעי החצר 6 משזר 100 בעמה, עמודיהם 20 ועדניהם 20 נחושת, העמודים וחשוקיהם כסף, ולפעת צפון 100 בעמה, עמודיהם 20 ועדניהם 20 נחושת, העמודים וחשוקיהם כסף, ולפעת יום כלואים 50 בעמה, עמודיהם 10 ועדניהם 10, העמודים וחשוקיהם כסף, ולקדמה מזרחה 50 אמה, כלואים 15 אמה, אל עמודיהם 3 ועדניהם 3, ולכתף השנית מזה ומזה לשאר חצר כלואים 15 אמה, עמודיהם 3 ועדניהם 3. Verse 16. כל כלאי חצר סביב 6 משזר, והעדניהם לעמודים נחושת, והעמודים וחשוקיהם כסף, וסיפוי ראשיהם כסף, והם מחושקים כסף, כל עמודי החצר, ומסך שאר החצר, מעשה רוקם, תכלת וארגמן, ותולעת שני, ו6 משזר, ו20 אמה, אורך וקומה ברוחב, ו5 אמות לעומת כלאי החצר, ועמודיהם 4 ועדניהם 4 נחושת, והם כסף, וציפוי ראשיהם וחשוקיהם כסף, וכל היתדות למשכן לחצר סביב נחושת. Okay, so that's the end of the parsha. So it's a very technical parsha. It's always difficult to approach these parshiot because there's no stories, right? There's no analysis of people, really. It's very technical building, and excuse me. And I mean, the best way to do this is really looking at pictures or videos. So I may play the video again of that I played a couple of weeks ago of when we visited Timna Park, which has a life-size replica of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. So, but we'll start going through. So that is the end of the parsha. We're going to go back to the beginning of the parsha, Exodus chapter 35, verse 1. And let's see what we can do. So once again, if anyone has any questions or any comments, please let me know. And we'll take it from there. So verse 1, Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat bnei Yisrael. So Moses gathered together all of the congregation, adat bnei Yisrael, v'yomer elehem ele dvarim asher tziwa Yehovah la'asot otam. So a couple of things here. So Yakel means to gather together. Kahal is a congregation. It's usually translated as. We know that that, well, we have the book of Ecclesiastes, which in Hebrew is Kohelet. So, and that is written by Shlomo Melech, by King Solomon. And Kohelet, some of the interpretations of the word Kohelet may be the one who gathers together, or the one who gathers together for the purpose of teaching, right? So let's even look at that for 1 second here. Oops, I should do this differently. So let's look at this word Kohelet here, okay? In Ecclesiastes 1:1, right? So the word Kohelet here, they translated teacher. But let's look at some of the other, let's see how we do this. No, let's see how we do it. Ecclesiastes 1:1. What did I do here? Okay. So we get a bunch of, I'm looking for a bunch of different translations here. 1 second here. Is it interlinear? No, that's something else. Parallel. It's parallel? Yeah, so we got it here. It's translated as teacher, teacher, preacher, teacher, preacher, 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 teacher, teacher, preacher, preacher, etc. Right? Here, JPS is translated as Kohelet, preacher. So teacher or preacher, right? But it really, at least it's believed, and probably does, comes from this same underlying root, right? So if we see again in the Hebrew, Kohelet. Okay, so Divrei Kohelet. So this is actually, so if the underlying root is kahal kuf he lamed, then this would actually be the present active female. Oh, my cat just, Lovey, what are you doing? You want something, don't you? Oh, outside. Come here. Okay, so Kohelet would actually be the present female third person singular form. Okay, so it would be like she gathers together. Why is it in the female form? I'm not sure. I'd have to do a little bit more research and thought about that. At any rate, this is the same underlying root as we see here, Vayakhel, right? So Moshe gathered together, Vayakhel. We also know that, and we saw it here. Let me just bring this up. We also know that this commandment in, where is it? Well, there's a lot of places where the assembly is gathered together. Even Korach gathers the assembly together. Yakel aleim Korach, but I'm looking for a very specific thing. I think it's in Deuteronomy, if I'm not mistaken. Where is that again? 1 second. One second. find it right now. This is it, Deuteronomy 4. So, again, let's just look at the English for 2 seconds, and then we can switch over to the Hebrew if we need, just to save some time. Oops. What was it again? Deuteronomy 4:10. No, this is not it. All right, I can't find it for some reason, so it doesn't matter. But where is the mitzvah? It's weird. One 12. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so למען ישמעו למען ילמדו ויראו את יהוה אלוהיכם וכתוב משה את התורה הזאת ויתנה את הכהנים בני לוי בבא. One second. One second. Huh. For some reason I can't find the verse I'm looking for. All right, we'll just forget it. I'm not going to get bogged down. All right, so at any rate, so this underlying root kahal, right? So let's look at this underlying root kahal. Right, so kahal is usually translated here, we could see as an assembly, convocation, congregation. It's usually translated as a congregation, okay? And according to the BDB, again, assembly, convocation, congregation. And I'm actually looking for the underlying. Here, this is the underlying root or the verb kahal, right? To gather together, okay? To assemble as a kahal, as a congregation, okay? So that's what we have here. So Moshe is basically gathering the entire assembly, the entire people of Israel together, and he is going to explain to them some laws. V'yomer alehem el hadavarim asher tziwa Yehovah la'asot otam. So these are the things that Yehovah has commanded to do them, but then he really only speaks about one law, right? And that's the Shabbat. Okay, so he's just re-emphasizing the Shabbat, which I find a little bit strange. Why is he saying these are the things, and then he only gives one law, and he gives a new law regarding the Shabbat, which is the lo tivaru ish b'chol moshvatechem b'yom Shabbat. Well, let's look at some commentaries. Trying to bring in some new commentaries. I'll go to my usual, which is Robert Alter. See if he has anything to say to it. But we're going to try some new commentaries today. So this is Exodus 35, 1. Okay, the initial clause which brings us back to the uninterrupted instructions regarding the tabernacle, beginning with the law of the Shabbat that concluded those instructions, 31:12 to 17. So let's look at 31. Let's close this off, and I'll open this as a new. It's 31:17. Okay, so here we have, let's get the context here. So here in 31, we have laws about the Shabbat. And then he gets the tablets of stone, and then we have the whole thing with the golden calf. So the golden calf is Exodus 32, Exodus 33, and a whole bunch of intervening things. Right? It's all basically the fallout from the golden calf, the new stone tablets. And then we have more laws, the radiant face of Moses. So what Robert Alter is basically saying here is that this is a continuation of what we saw in Exodus 35, is a continuation of what we saw in Exodus 31. Does that really make sense? Well, let's look. Exodus 31, once again, if we go back to it, so let's say the golden calf never would have happened. I mean, there's still laws that are given here, but one could say that these are kind of laws associated with the fallout from the golden calf. There's all golden calf stuff. It's all golden calf stuff. It's all golden calf stuff. But then we have some new laws. Do not make idols, celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, Shabbat, festival of weeks. Don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. How does this start here? Let's look. One second. The people obey the command, what I command you today. Be careful, do not worship other God. And then it goes into a whole bunch of laws. Okay. But basically, I guess what Robert Alter is saying is that this picks up from Exodus 31, right? So Exodus 31, again, we saw was Shabbat, and now he's continuing with the Shabbat. So this is almost a continuation. I don't know. I'm not sure if I buy that explanation, but it's an interesting explanation. Let's read this again. And Moses assembled all the community, the initial clause, which brings us back to the interrupted instructions regarding the tabernacle, beginning with the law of the Shabbat that concluded with the instructions that conclude those instructions, 31, 12, 17, is a neat reversal of the inception of the golden calf episode. The people assembled against Aaron. Okay, so I guess he's saying that was the golden calf was an interruption, and now we're getting back to Shabbat and the building of the tabernacle. All right, I don't know. I'm not sure if I buy that, but we'll go with it for now. Okay, let's see if there's anything else he has to say. This very brief version of the law of the Shabbat is a kind of digest of the earlier iteration of the Shabbat obligation. There is a good deal of summarizing repetition of earlier material and all that follows. Okay, you should not kindle a fire. This prohibition is a new specification. The lighting of fires might well be associated with the tasks involved in constructing the tabernacle, because fire would have been required for all the metalwork, and in one Ugaritic text, fire is burned 6 days in order to erect a sanctuary for Baal. But the kindling of fires against merely making use of fire that has been set accidentally is clearly a primary labor of civilization, as the Prometheus myth suggests, a kind of inauguration of technology, and so it is understandable that a special prohibition of it on Shabbat should be spelled out. So this is kind of what I agree with here, right? That this has to do with the fact that this would have been a primary form of labor in ancient times, the building and the tending to fires, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. So at any rate, Sheshit Yamim Ta'aseh Melacha Ubiyom HaShvi'i Yeh Lechem Kodesh should be a holy day or holy thing for you. Shabbat Shabbaton Liyehovah Kol HaOseh Bo Melacha Yumat. So anyone who does any kind of milacha, any kind of work on it, shall die. Lo tivaru eish b'chol mashvatechem b'yom Shabbat. So this has obviously been interpreted in many different ways. We know how the Karaites traditionally interpret it. They understand this to mean that all fires should be put out before the Shabbat comes in. In fact, the Egyptian Karaites are so ridiculous in this that they actually turn off all electricity. Well, the very strict ones will turn off all electricity in their house, I believe. Well, I know that when we used to learn in the Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem that we would come in on, I think we would do our studies on Thursday nights, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember the freezer, it was actually disgusting, would be packed with ice because it was always left off because it was not supposed to be running on the Shabbat. Because not only are you not allowed to light fire or do work, you're not allowed to have anything else, including machines, do work for you. So this is obviously an extreme and ridiculous interpretation. The standard Karaite interpretation, which I also disagree with, is that all fires should be put out before the Shabbat comes in. This is opposed to the Rabbinites, who, in this case, credit where credit is due. They have a much more reasonable approach to it, and they believe that all fires must be lit before the Shabbat comes in, but you cannot light any new fires over the Shabbat. So that allows fires to continue burning, right? Hence the Shabbat candles, right? Whereas the Karaites would not allow Shabbat candles. Obviously, no fire is allowed to remain lit once the Shabbat comes in. I actually disagree with both of these ideas, and what I believe and what I believe for many years is that this is just a paradigm. So, or let me put it differently. We saw before that words don't always mean exactly, they're not always referring directly exactly to what they mean, that they could be referring to causes, or for example, let me find, where was that again? Exodus, it was right here, I believe. No, it was when the Israelites brought all of the stuff. So here we saw, okay? So this, let's get even an English translation for this. Let's get a standard English translation. So this is Exodus 36:7. So here we go, Exodus 37. So let me give a literal translation, okay? Exodus 36:7, I'm translating now literally by myself from the Hebrew. The work. The work was enough, or too much, was enough for all of the work to do, or all of the work that was needed to be done, and more. So what does that mean? The work was enough for all of the work that needed to be done and more? That really is nonsensical, and that's not what it's speaking about here. This word hamilacha here is representing the material. Even though it says the work, it really means the material, because what's the context here? The Israelites brought all kinds of different materials, right? So that's why we have an English translation here. It doesn't say anything that the work was enough. It says because what they had already had, right? What they already had. This is how the NIV is translating hamilacha haita dayam. It's translating as what they already had was more than enough to do all the work. Okay, let's get another translation. Go to parallel. Okay, 36:7. Their contributions were more than enough, right? So milacha, which really means work, the word melacha means work, right? So, but here it's being translated as contributions, as that which they had, as materials, okay? For the material they had, okay? Since what they had, for the stuff they had, that's an interesting, the stuff they had was sufficient for all the work, okay? The material, so it's being translated as material, stuff, things, what they had, etc., etc. So what we see here, or what we learn from this, is that this is the word milacha here doesn't mean work directly. What it means is the materials required to do the work. Okay, and let's see even if we can see other instances of this kind of use of the word melacha. In fact, let me just see one thing here for my own edification. Property in which one is occupied. Right, so here they translate it as property, right? Workmanship, service, political, religious. So, did they give the example? Let me just see here of our verses. Field, workmanship, service. So really, I guess this is the one that comes closest to it, right? Property in which one is occupied or something along those lines, okay? So let's read through these verses here, in fact, okay? This is Exodus 36. So verse 2 says, Vayikra Moshe el Betzalel ve'el Oholiav ve'el kol ish Hakham Melech asher natan Yehovah chachma b'libo. So Moshe called to Betzalel and Oholiav and every man of wise heart, asher natan Yehovah chachma b'libo, to whom Yehovah had given wisdom in his heart. Kol asher nasa'o libo, anyone who he raised up his heart, meaning what God raised up his heart, the karva el milacha asotata, to bring him close to the milacha, to the work. Okay, and this is the talking about in this context the work of the temple, the work of the tabernacle. Okay, lasotata, to do it. So they took from before Moshe, meaning who's they? In this case, it's Betzalel and Aholiab. So this is Betzalel is basically the head artisan, and Aholiab is, you can call him the assistant or the assistant head artisan, right? The assistant to the head artisan. So they took from Betzalel and Aholiab took from Moshe all of the donations, which the children of Israel had brought lemelechet avodat kodesh, for the work of the lemelechet avodat kodesh, for the work of the holy service, you could say, asot ota. Or let me translate it this way: for the making or for the work associated with building the avodat kodesh lesotota. It's a tough one to translate into English. At any rate, the material required for the work, and they brought more donations every morning. Verse 4, and all of the wise men or the skilled men who were doing the work on the holy stuff came, each person according to the work which he was doing. Okay, verse 5, and they said to Moses, the people are bringing too much, more than is required for the work. Let me see if I can get a good translation. So the people are bringing too much, more than is required for the work that Yehovah commanded to do it. And Moshe commanded, that a proclamation be made throughout the camp. Lemor ish wa isha al yasu od milacha l'trumat hakodesh. That no person, no man or woman should do more tasks or should not do any more work in the donation to the holy place. Okay. המלאכה הייתה דיים לכל המלאכה לעשות אותה והותר. So, and then we have this sentence over here. המלאכה הייתה דיים לכל המלאכה לעשות אותה והותר. And here we have the material, right? So in this case, even though the word melacha means work, it represents, as we saw in many of the translations, material, okay? So this really means hamelacha, this really means the material that was required or that was needed for the work, right? So this is, hamelacha is the result of the material that was brought. So here we have the result being substituted for or shall we say we have the word that represents the result being used to represent that which causes the result. Okay? I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I'm trying to. It's a bit of a difficult concept. Okay? But even though this says the work, literally it says the work was enough for all the work to do it, and more was enough for all the work to do and more. Okay? So here, milacha, what's being substituted is the result of the material, rather than, so the result of the material is being substituted for the material itself. It doesn't say hadvarim hayu dayam l'chol hamelacha la'asot ota ve'oter. That would have made more sense in a simple way. It says hamelacha hayta dayam. So the result of, or the cause of the milacha, okay, so the result is being substituted for the cause, right? It really should say the cause, which is the material, okay, or that which allows the milacha to be done. But here we have the result being substituted for it, okay? So the point that I was trying to make, if we go back to Exodus, where were we? 35. Oops. Is that it's very possibly the same thing here, okay? So when it says lo tivaru esh b'chol moshvatechem b'yom Shabbat, okay? That what we have here really is a lo tivaru esh b'chol moshvatechem b'yom Shabbat. That what we have here, it says, do not kindle a fire throughout all your inhabitants on the Shabbat day. But what it's really saying in this case is don't do any of the work associated with kindling a fire. Okay, so the word here is substituted for that which shall we say causes the fire, right? So lo tivaru esh b'chol moshvatechem yom Shabbat. Do not kindle or do not light or do not allow a fire to stay lit throughout all your habitations on the Shabbat day. Okay, the way I understand this, or what I understand this to mean, okay, is that it's really speaking about the work associated with the burning of fire. Okay, so it's here we have again the same paradigm. We have a similar paradigm. And what do I mean by that? Okay, so we have it here, lo tivaru esh. Okay, so we're being told not to make a fire, okay, or to kindle a fire. We'll just stay with make a fire, okay. But what we're really talking about, what I believe we're really talking about here, is not to do the work that causes the fire to be made, okay. So we have a similar situation here as we have in Exodus 37. Let me close them up side by side. I'm sorry, where was it? Exodus 36. Exodus 36, 7. Okay? So here, lo tivaru esh. Okay? This is the result of doing work which causes the fire to be kindled. Okay, here we have the result of the bringing of the stuff of the donations. So it's a similar construct. This is what I think. Okay, it's a similar construct where the result is substituted for the cause or that which allows it to happen. Here, when we have amilacha, which literally means the work was enough for all of the work that needed to be done and more. That's the literal translation. But the implication is that the material was enough. Right? It doesn't make sense to say the work was enough for all the work that needed to be done and more, right? But what it really means is the material was enough for all the work that needed to be done and more, right? Because the context here is they're bringing material, okay? So the result is substituted for the cause, or the result is substituted for the original word, the result of that word. We'll say the result is substituted for the cause. Here also, what is the result? Lo tivaru ish. Do not kindle a fire throughout all your habitations on the Shabbat day. This is the result. The cause is the milacha that is required to do the kindling of the fire. So I think we have a similar construct here and here, or a similar idea, that the result is being substituted for the cause. Okay? So what does that mean? Here, the result is the work, the cause is the donations. The real meaning here is the donations. Here, the result is the kindling or the burning of the fire. The cause is the work required for the burning of the fire. And that's what's really meant here. So the way I would interpret this, well, literally means do not kindle, do not burn. I'll just stick with do not burn. Do not burn fire throughout your habitations on the Shabbat day. But what I really think it means is do not do the work required to tend a fire or to keep a fire burning throughout all your habitations on Shabbat day. Okay? And I'll give you a couple of reasons for this. Okay? I'm sorry my explanation was a little bit convoluted, but I don't prepare these studies in advance. This is like on the fly, right? So I'll try to sum it up what I'm trying to say here. Okay? So if we understand that this is the result of the lo tivaru ish, okay, do not kindle a fire, but what it's really acting as is a substitute for the cause, which is the work required to kindling the fire, then what this really means is don't do any work required to kindle a fire on the Shabbat day. So what would be the work required to kindle a fire? Okay, well, in order to understand that, we have to think back to ancient times and realize there were no space heaters and no floorboard, pipes under the floorboard for floor-based, whatever they call that, base heating or floor-based heating. I can't remember what it's called. There was no centralized heating or anything like that, right? People in the desert were living in tents or they were living in houses, and the only way they were able to cook and keep warm was to keep the fire going, right? And anyone who thinks that Israel doesn't get cold in the wintertime has obviously never been to Israel. Maybe if you live in Eilat, even in Eilat, it can get cold sometimes at night because it's a desert. I wonder what the temperature is in Eilat right now. Well, I won't even check, but let's see. Just for fun, okay, let's see in Eilat what the temperature is going to be tonight. Eilat is maybe one of the warmest places in Israel. And the temperature tonight is going down into the low 50s. Okay, not so bad, right? In Jerusalem, the temperature is now 48, and tonight this week it's going to be in the high 40s Fahrenheit I'm talking about. I'm sorry, low 40s and high 30s. Well, that's already getting pretty unpleasant. Let's look at, let's say in the Golan Heights. Let's look at Katzrin. It comes up there. It is Katzrin in the Golan Heights. So it's going to be in the 40s. All right. Let's find another example. Let's look at Tzfat. So again, low 40s, high 30s. Okay. So these are. Let's look at Mount Hermon. It doesn't come up. Mountain ski area. No, that's. At any rate, you get the idea. The fact of the matter is it can get quite cold at night in Israel, even out in the desert in the wintertime, especially when you go up into higher elevations like in northern Israel or even the hills of Jerusalem, right? It snows from time to time in Jerusalem. It can get down in rare cases into the low 30s and high 20s, right? And so it's not pleasant, right? We even know if, let's say, the temperature even gets down into the 40s at night or something like that, or the 30s. Without heat, that's a very unpleasant situation, right? So the main way that the only way that people kept warm, and of course the only way they were able to cook their food in ancient times was using fires, right? So obviously there was a lot of work associated with keeping a fire going, right? You had to gather wood. You even have the example of the wood gatherer who goes out on Shabbat, right? The Mikoshe Sheitzim, he's put to death for gathering wood on Shabbat. Okay, the wood has to be gathered. It has to be chopped up. It has to be assembled. The fire has to be started, right? Starting a fire is not usually very easy, right? If you're starting it from scratch, you have to start with small twigs and you have to build it up, and it takes time. You have to blow on it and you have to tend it, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of work associated with keeping a fire going or with making a fire, right? However, there's not a lot of work associated with, once the fire is going, just taking another log and tossing it on. If you've done all your prep work in advance before the Shabbat, let's say you have the fire going and you have a bunch of logs all ready to go, right? As long as the fire doesn't go out, then you could take another log every hour or so and just toss it on the fire and keep it going. That's not a lot of work, okay? But generally, preparing a fire is a lot of work. So I think that what's going on here in the Torah is what the Torah is saying is that it's taking a prime example of what would have been work in ancient times, or at least what would have been work on the Shabbat, right? So we're not going to go out and tend the flocks on the Shabbat or something like that, but we do want to keep the fire going, right? Because it gets cold at night, and so therefore, I think what the Torah is saying is this example of a what would have been a prime melacha on Shabbat, and saying no, you can't do the Shabbat. You can't do melacha basically, okay? You can't do work. Specifically in the case or the paradigm of doing work on the Shabbat would have been starting the fire. Okay, so as long as you're keeping the fire going and no real work is required or not a lot of work is required, then I think that's fine. Okay, so if you have the fire all set up and you're tossing a log or two on it every hour or so, that's not really work. That just takes a second. Okay, but if you have to go start the fire from scratch, you have to go gather the wood, chop the wood, assemble the wood near the fire, start the fire, etc. That all has to be done before Shabbat. And I think that's a much more logical explanation than either the Rabbinites would say or the Karaites would say. Certainly than the Karaites would say. The Rabbinites actually have it a little bit better. They kind of say that, yes, you can keep the fire. You can't touch the fire once it's on, when Shabbat comes in. But you can have it stay on once the Shabbat comes in, as long as you started it before the Shabbat, right? The Karaites, the traditional Karaite interpretation is once Shabbat comes in, that's it. You have to extinguish all your fires. And in fact, the Egyptian Karaites, which go to, who are ridiculously extreme in this case, in many cases, they actually not only extinguish all fires, but they turn off all electricity. And I don't even know what the heck they do anymore. And I don't even know how many of the Egyptian Karaites follow it. But that's in theory what they do. So that's just ridiculous. It doesn't make sense that a fire would not be going in Israel. Just think, okay, you were living at the base of Mount Hermon. It's getting down. It's wintertime. It's snowing. It's getting down into the 20s or even the teens at night. This is not Shabbat. You're gonna have to. This is not an enjoyable Shabbat at all, even during the day and especially at night, right? So it just doesn't make logical sense that you wouldn't be allowed to have a fire going. So what I think this means is, as we said before, the lo tivaru esh, do not kindle fire, okay, means do not. This is the result being substituted for the cause. The result is the kindling of the fire. The cause is the milacha, the work associated with the kindling of the fire. So the way I would really translate this is do not do any milacha associated with the kindling of a fire throughout all your habitations on the Shabbat day. Just as what's that? That's a good question. And I'm going to look at that in a second. Okay, just as here in Exodus 36:7, we have the result being substituted for the cause. The result is the milacha, the work. Okay, that's the work of the building of the tabernacle. But what it's really talking about is the cause, or that which allows the work to be done, which is the material that was brought by the Israelites. That's why all the translators here translate it as stuff, material, that which, right? They never translate it as work, because here you have the result being substituted for the cause. Here you have the result being substituted for the cause. And this is a major mistake when people interpret the Torah, try to read biblical Hebrew, they take it too literally. Ironically, as I've said for years, the Rabbinites accuse the Karaites of taking things too literally. Well, the Egyptian Karaites, in this case, definitely live up to that that accusation. But shall we say, the more independently thinking Karaites, such as myself, and there are others, I'm the only one, realize that not everything should be taken literally in the Torah, that you have to understand how the Torah works, how the Torah uses words and language to try to get meaning out of it. And in this case, what I think is going on here is exactly that the result is being substituted for the cause. And I'll give a couple more proofs for why I think that, and we'll go to, as Moki says, we'll go to some of the commentaries, and we'll see what they have to say. But I gave a logical proof. Okay, it's just not logical that fire should not be going on Shabbat in Israel. Okay, someone who's never been to Israel thinks Israel's just a giant desert, and it's 95 degrees during the day or 90 degrees during the day, and at night it goes down into the 60s or something like that. That could not be farther from the truth. Israel, as anyone who has been to Israel knows, is a very varied land. There's higher elevations, there's lower elevations. There's a lot of different climates when they're very small, within a very small region, within a very small state. And it can get very cold at times. It can be very hot at times. It can be hot during the day and cold at night, and it could be very rainy, and it could be very sunny, and it really changes very quickly from place to place. So even if you go from like Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, during the wintertime at night in Tel Aviv, it might get down into the 50s, whereas in Jerusalem it could already be in the low 40s or the high 30s, because you're inland and you're in higher elevations. If you go up north where you have taller mountains, then in the wintertime it even gets colder, and there's snow on a regular basis, like up around Tzfat and these areas. Okay, no, Miron. So at any rate, it's just not logical to be commanded to extinguish all fires before Shabbat comes in. Okay, so maybe the Rabbinites are correct. Maybe it just means keep the fire going, or light the fire before the Shabbat comes in, and then don't touch it. What's the problem with that? If you don't touch the fire during Shabbat, it's going to go out, right? What do the Rabbinites do today? Well, they're lucky. They can set up timers and turn the heat on and turn the heat off, or they have central heating and it goes on, centrally controlled, or they have a Shabbos goy come in and flip their heat on, or whatever the case may be, right? But this is not. This is how they deal with it in the modern age, and they're basically avoiding the main point, that if they were out in the woods somewhere, right, which is basically, ancient living was kind of like that, right, in a certain sense, right? You didn't have technology, you didn't have advanced technologies like we have today. What are you going to do on the Shabbat? You're basically going to have the fire come. You're going to have the fire lit before the Shabbat comes in. It's going to go out, and then you're out of luck. Okay. There's no timers to set, or lights, or Shabbos goys to flip on and off switches, or whatever the case may be. I don't know. Maybe you can use the Erev Rav to light a new fire for you, get a local, Canaanite or something. But I don't think that's what's going on here. I think it's logical to assume that the Torah could not possibly be outlawing fire on the Shabbat day. So from a logical point of view, that chucks out both the traditional Karaite interpretation and the Rabbinite interpretation, because in the Karaite interpretation, everything goes off before the Shabbat goes in. You're going to freeze your butt off. In the rabbinical interpretation, you might be nice and warm on a Friday night for a while, but it's going to be quite cold a couple of hours afterwards, Okay, you could say maybe the fire will last enough time for you to go to sleep, and then by the time the morning comes, it's already daylight, and then it's warmer outside, and then Shabbat goes out, so you can light a fire. But that doesn't make sense to me because it could be very cold in the morning, it could be very cold in the late afternoon, it could be even cold during the day in certain places and at certain times during the year. So that doesn't make sense to me either. It just doesn't seem logical to me from a common sense point of view that 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 fire cannot be left continually going on the Shabbat. It just would make a very, very unpleasant Shabbat. If the Shabbat is supposed to be the day of rest, if it's supposed to be a pleasant and pleasurable day where even the animals rest and even the servants and the maid servants rest and your sons and your daughters rest and everyone's supposed to have a nice restful day. If you're freezing your butt off, it's not going to be a very nice restful day, right? If you're walking around with coats on and overcoats and constantly trying to stay warm and you're eating, you're sitting there freezing in the cold, that is not a pleasant day. So it just does not make logical sense. And as I've always said for years, the Torah, the unwritten commandment in the Torah is do such and such a mitzvah if it makes sense. It's gotta make common sense. Okay, the Torah is not written to create some kind of bizarre cult where you're suffering to prove your loyalty to God. Okay, the Torah is written in a way so that you can have wisdom and happiness in your life. Okay, and the mitzvot have to be logical and have to make sense, or else they couldn't possibly come from Yehovah, who is the founder of all logic and all common sense, right? So that's one proof, okay? But there are other proofs as well, okay? And another proof I gave is grammatical, right? It's grammatically feasible here that the result is being substituted for the cause. So again, the result is lo tivaru esh, don't keep a fire going on Shabbat. The cause of that is don't do the milacha that's associated with making a fire. Okay, so don't gather the wood, don't chop the wood, don't start a fire from scratch. But if you have logs set up, you can toss a log on there. That's what I believe, because that's not milacha. That doesn't require work. It requires a little bit amount of work. But you know what? There's always a little bit amount of work that has to be done on Shabbat. As I've also been saying for years, there's no one who doesn't do some work on Shabbat, right? Unless you have, let's say you eat Friday night meal, Saturday day meal, and Saturday and Sudah Shlishit, right? Saturday late afternoon meal, right? That's 3 meals. What, you don't clear the table after the first meal? Isn't that milacha, right? Doesn't the wife or the husband or both, they usually take the dishes and they'll at least put them in the sink and they'll clean off the table. That's milacha right there. That's work, right? So you're doing work on Shabbat, right? Unless you have 3 separate tables set up and you just have everything set up, okay? All the tables set, 3 separate tables, one for Friday night meal, another table for Saturday day meal, another table for Sudah Shlishit, for Saturday late afternoon meal. You eat and then you just leave everything on the table. And the next day you go to the second table, you eat your morning meal, leave everything on the table, and you eat, then etc. You get the idea, right? So everyone does milacha on Shabbat. Even if you're taking the food out of the refrigerator, right, to put on the table, that's milacha on Shabbat. Okay, if you're going to the bathroom, that's milacha on Shabbat, right? To a certain degree, right? You're always doing some milacha on Shabbat. So the idea is to keep it to a minimum, okay? To have everything set up in advance as much as possible so that the milacha that you have to do, the amount of work that you have to do on Shabbat is kept to a minimum. So the idea on Shabbat is don't do any unnecessary work on Shabbat. Some work that's necessary on Shabbat, it must always be done. At any rate, this brings us to another proof regarding milacha. Another reason why I think that this is Shabbat Shalom, Raphael Mike, my friend from Uganda. Another reason why I think that this is referring to milacha is this is the only time ever in all of the mentions of Shabbat that we're being told to do anything that is not explicitly milacha, right? Whenever we have whenever we have a mention of Shabbat, it always says, don't do milacha, don't do milacha, don't do milacha. There are no other rules on the Shabbat except don't do milacha, right? So why suddenly is this other rule introduced? It doesn't make sense. This would just have to be basically a substitute or basically a paradigm, basically an example of not doing milacha. Okay, or else suddenly this other law occurs, and it never occurs anywhere else. This is the only time lo tivaru esh, don't kindle a fire, is ever mentioned anywhere in the entire Torah with regards to the Shabbat. The only law we've seen regarding the Shabbat up until now is don't do milacha, aside from keeping it holy, etc., etc. But the restrictions that we have only always been mentioned as don't do milacha. Okay, there's no other place anywhere in the Torah where it says don't kindle fire. This is the only place. I don't think it's saying that here. It's saying don't do milacha, but it's giving the example of doing the milacha required to make a fire or to keep a fire going on, I'll say to make a fire on the Shabbat. Okay. So, and I was going to say one more thing. Let me just see if I can remember it. It was important. I forgot it. 1 second here. I can't remember it, but it'll come to me in a second. Okay. We also have specific examples, right? We have the Mikol Sheisha Eitzim. Let's even take a look at that. So that's going to be. Oops. That's going to be. Where is this? Numbers 15. So let's go to Numbers 15 for a second. So Numbers 15, I'll just bring it up in English. Here, so I'll just read it very quickly in English just to speed through it. While the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Shabbat day. It doesn't say he had a fire burning in his house on the Shabbat day, okay? Or it doesn't even say he was chucking a log onto the fire on the Shabbat day. He was out gathering wood. That's hard work. Have you ever gathered wood? Have you ever gone camping, or do you live in a place where you need to gather wood for, I don't know, your wood burning stove, and you don't buy it at, Walmart or something like that? You have to go out and gather wood. That's a lot of hard work. Okay, so he's out gathering wood on the Shabbat day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody because it was not clear what should be done to him. Then Yahweh said to Moses that the man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp. So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death as Yahweh commanded Moses. So that's that, right? It says they kept him in custody. It doesn't say explicitly. I would assume so. I would assume they kept him in custody until after the Shabbat. I don't know. At any rate, so this is someone who was clearly doing work, right? So gathering wood is obviously associated only with building a fire. You didn't build your houses out of wood in those days. You built your houses out of stone, right? So he's gathering wood for the sake of tending to a fire or building a fire on the Shabbat day. This is milacha. This is the milacha that we're talking about. That's associated. That's the cause of this lo tivaru esh. Okay, do not burn. Let a fire burn. Do not kindle a fire. This is the result. Okay, the milacha, the work associated with doing that, is the cause. Okay, so that's what we see here. That he was put to death for actually doing work, right? For doing hard work on the Shabbat day, not respecting the Shabbat, not resting on the Shabbat. Okay, there's a big difference between going out into the woods and gathering wood, okay, which takes hours and you have to drag it all back and you have to do a lot of work, and between just tossing a log on the fire, okay, every hour, okay, which you have right next to the fire waiting to go, okay. So that again is kind of we should say what's the word? I forgot the word. Empirical proof that we're talking about the actual work associated with building the fire and not actually letting the fire run on Shabbat. Okay. And again, the another proof is the fact that everywhere else it always says don't do milacha, don't do milacha, don't do milacha. This is the only place in the entire Torah where you have any other restriction on Shabbat besides doing milacha, and that implies that this is actually also talking about milacha. Okay, don't do melacha. It's just using the example of building a fire. It's talking about don't do the melacha associated with building a fire, which would have been one of the main, which would have been one of the main activities on the Shabbat that the people might do. As proof, we see in Numbers 15 the example of the Mikoshei Shitzim, the example of the person who's going out to gather the wood. Okay, so to make a long story short, I don't agree with the Karaites, the standard Karaite interpretation that you should not have fire burning at all. I don't agree with the Rabbinite interpretation that you can have the fire burning before the Shabbat goes in, but you can't touch it once the Shabbat goes in. I think that doesn't make sense either, because eventually the fire is going to go out and then you're going to be left in the cold, literally and figuratively. What I believe is that you should do only the minimum work necessary to keep the fire going on the Shabbat, which means doing all the preparations before the Shabbat, and then on the Shabbat, just throwing a log in when you need to every hour or two or something like that. That's not work. That's just a tiny amount of work. It's far less work than what Rabbinite wives will do by setting the table, clearing the table, putting the dishes in the sink, and a bunch of other things, other work that one does on the Shabbat. Okay, what does this mean? This has great implications. This means that that lighting of a fire is not permitted per se, ipso facto, in and of itself. It's permitted only if work. The only thing that's permitted is milacha, is work. Okay, unnecessary work. So, can one drive a car on Shabbat? In my opinion, absolutely yes. There's no work associated with driving a car. You take a key, you go, and that's it. The fire's lit. You're not doing any work. It's less than even taking a log and throwing it on the fire. Okay, so can you drive a combustion engine car on the Shabbat? In my opinion, yes. In fact, I always used to say to Rabbinites, you'll actually save yourself work by driving on the Shabbat. I remember in Israel, many times people will walk either to the Beit Knesset is usually close by, but they might walk to their Rebbe for Shabbat lunch, right? Sometimes they can walk for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, to walk to some family where they're going to have lunch, either their relatives or their rabbi or whatever the case may be. They're walking out in the middle of August. It's 102 degrees outside, and they're walking in the blazing sun for an hour to get to their Rebbe for Shabbat, for Shabbat lunch meal. Is that melacha? Hell yeah, that's melacha. That's a lot of melacha. That's unpleasant and that's hard work. Remember, Jerusalem is hilly, right? You're walking up hills, okay, and especially when they're wearing that ridiculous outfit with the black hat and the long black pants, and sometimes they have overcoats on and whatever the heck they put on themselves, right? These Haredim are it's August 15th. It's 102 degrees outside. They're walking up and down the hills of Har Nof, a very hilly area to get to their Rebbe, whose house is 45 minutes away. That's milacha. Wouldn't it be much less milacha if you just got in the car, flipped the switch, and drove for 10 minutes to your Rebbe's house for lunch? Obviously. So by understanding this as an example of milacha, and therefore the restriction being, once again, not do milacha, and the only restriction on Shabbat being don't do milacha, okay, then you're actually going to save yourself a lot of work rather than cause yourself a lot of work. A lot more to say about this, but my basic bottom line for the Shabbat is it is not asur, it's not forbidden to light a fire. In fact, let me be a little bit sensationalistic and do it right now. I'll light a fire. Okay, this, you don't have to wait. Okay, this does not work. Yeah, better be careful with the computer. Okay, that's not work. Okay, that requires no work whatsoever. Okay, walking for an hour in 102 and 95 degree Fahrenheit weather in an outfit that is fit for a winter in Krakow, Poland, that's work. Okay, so therefore that's my take on the whole thing. You're not supposed to do milacha. It's not forbidden to light a fire per se on Shabbat. You're not supposed to do any milacha, including that which is required to light a fire. And a corollary to that, or an addendum to that, would be everyone has to do some milacha on Shabbat. The most strict Haredi housewife is still clearing the dishes off the table and wiping off the table on Shabbat, and is still taking the food out of the refrigerator and setting the table for Suda Shlishit on Shabbat, right? that's milacha. Okay, so there's a certain minimal amount of milacha that should be done, but you're not supposed to do any unnecessary milacha. You're supposed to keep milacha to an absolute minimum. Everything is supposed to be as much as possible prepared in advance, and and uh, and uh, and on Shabbat, you're supposed to keep your milacha to a minimum. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, we were going to go out for dinner to eat somewhere, and Friday night dinner to eat somewhere, and all of a sudden the washing machine leaked, and there was water all over the floor, and Shabbat was just about coming in. Am I supposed to leave that and let it soak in through the through the floorboards, or cause damage, or just cause the potential harm when someone slips on it? No, that has to be cleaned up. That's a necessary task on Shabbat. You cannot wait until Motzi Shabbat or Sunday to do it. It had to be done then. Okay, there's no choice. Okay, that's a necessary task on Shabbat. What's restricted is unnecessary tasks on Shabbat. Everything should be prepared as much as possible in advance. It should be prepared in advance. Maybe the table should be set as much as possible in advance, but that doesn't mean you can't clear the table after you eat your Shabbat meal, right? You're not going to leave it there, right? Again, I give the ridiculous analogy of having 3 tables. I don't know, maybe some Karaites going to hear this and start doing it. You have 1 table for Friday night meal, 1 table for Saturday day meal, 1 table for Suda Shlishit, okay? Because it's milacha to clear the dishes after you eat. So you just leave it there, and the next morning, in the morning you go to the 2nd table, for Suda Shlishit, you go to the 3rd table, you just leave everything there. Even then, you're going to be doing milacha. You still have to take the food out of the refrigerator unless you leave all the food there. Anyway, it gets ridiculous. So it doesn't make sense to say that no milacha can be done on Shabbat. We're supposed to keep our milacha to a minimum, to as much as possible, a minimum. Okay? So let's just review. We saw a parallel between Exodus 37. I'm sorry, I think it was Exodus 36. Let's bring it up again. Between Exodus 36:7, where the word milacha is the result being substituted for the cause, which is the donations. So this word here really means donations, but what's being written here is the work. But it really means the donations allowing the work to be done. So we see it can happen in biblical Hebrew. Often happens with the word milacha, which is interesting because here we're also talking about milacha. But at any rate, we often see that the result can be substituted for the cause. So likewise here, I would claim that where it says don't kindle a fire, don't light a fire on Shabbat, this is the result being substituted for the cause. What it really means is don't do the milacha, don't do the work necessary or associated with kindling a fire on Shabbat. Okay? That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, and I remember now what I also want to say. Point number 2 is there is nowhere else in the entire Torah that this law appears, that a restriction against lighting fire on Shabbat appears. Okay? This is the only place in the entire Torah. In fact, this is the only place in the entire Tanakh. Okay? When violations of the Shabbat are spoken about, for instance, in the book of Jeremiah, or for instance, in the book of Nehemiah, it never speaks about lighting a fire on Shabbat. It speaks about carrying loads into the city, carrying on business on the day of the Shabbat. Never, ever, anywhere in the entire Tanakh is the mention of lighting a fire on Shabbat. Does it ever occur? Only in this place, only in Exodus 35:3. Okay? So that's proof number 2. Okay, and we just mentioned at the beginning of the study that the Shabbat is mentioned many times. In fact, it's one of the most mentioned laws in the entire Torah. And we said that when a law is mentioned many times in the Torah, it shows its importance. The more a law is mentioned, for instance, idol worship, okay, for instance, murder, the more important it is. And the Shabbat we saw was mentioned in Exodus, I think it was 31. It's mentioned in Exodus 20. It's mentioned before that when we're speaking about the gathering of the manna. So the Shabbat is a very important. It's mentioned many times, but never, ever, anywhere except Exodus 35:3 is this mentioned, not to kindle a fire on Shabbat. So that's proof number 2. Now, proof number 3, which is what I wanted to say before, is what's the reason? There has to be a logical reason for it. Okay? So proof number 3 is no. So proof number 1 is grammatical proof. We see that the result can be substituted for the cause. Proof number 2 is that lo tivaru esh never appears anywhere else in the Tanakh. In the Tanakh. Proof number 3 would be a common sense proof. Okay, so common sense proof is that it doesn't make sense that fires would be restricted on Shabbat, because there are places in Israel which can get very cold, and it would be an extremely unpleasant Shabbat if fire were not allowed to be on, okay, or to be allowed to be burning. Okay, so that takes the standard Karaite interpretation and throws it right out the window, but also the rabbinical interpretation, because the rabbis would allow a fire, right? In ancient times, the fire might be burning when the Shabbat came in, but soon it would go out and then you'd freeze your butt off. Okay, so just common sense arguments. Okay, and the next argument would be what I would call a logical argument. If you want to say that fire cannot be lit on the Shabbat, give me a reason for it. What would be the reason? It doesn't make any sense. It makes sense that milacha should not be done on Shabbat. We're given reasons why milacha should not be done on Shabbat. In Exodus 20, it says, don't do milacha in order that your son, your daughter, your servant, your maidservant, your animals can rest on the Shabbat. You don't do work so that you're not causing them to do work. Okay, you're not. If you start, plowing the fields on Shabbat, you're going to say, hey, maidservant, or hey, servant, come help me plow the fields on Shabbat. You're supposed to give them, you take the day off in order so that everybody gets the day off, right? It's kind of like Christmas or Thanksgiving, what used to be Thanksgiving and Christmas in America. Now people are actually working on Thanksgiving. It's another story. Okay, so we're given reasons. Another reason we're given is to remember that God rested on the 7th day. Right? We're given actual reasons why we're not supposed to do milakha on the Shabbat. Right? It's not just random. Okay, but if you want to say we're not supposed to light a fire on the Shabbat, what's the reason? Tell me what the reason is. It doesn't make any sense. There's no reason given here, and there's no logical reason for it. Okay, milakha is a logical reason. You don't want it's a day of rest. Okay, so not doing milakha makes perfect sense. You're not going to do work on this day of rest. God rested. Everyone is allowed to rest. Is allowed to have a day off, even the animals. So everyone's going to rest. But to not light a fire, what would be the reason? To not do the milakha, to not do the work associated with lighting a fire, that makes sense, and that's exactly what I believe this means. But to not light a fire, to not do this, where were we? To not do this, that doesn't make sense. That's not work. Okay? So, and let me again go back to here. Okay? So give me a logical reason. Okay? Yehovah, he's the founder of logic. He's the founder of reason and logic and common sense. There's no common sense reason to not have a fire burning on the Shabbat. So now it becomes a mystical thing, right? So now it becomes mysticism. Okay, there's some mystical, unknown reason floating up in the sky. God told us to do it, and some mystical reason. Fire represents, creation, and fire represents this and that. You've got to come up with all kinds of mystical reasons. And so now you've turned the Torah from a book of laws into a book of mysticism. That's another reason. So that's what I'll call the logical reason. Okay, so we have the grammatical reason. We have the occurrence reason, that it doesn't occur anywhere else. We have the common sense reason, that it wouldn't make sense to not have a fire lighting even in the land of Israel on the Shabbat. You're going to freeze, okay, or you're going to be very unpleasantly cold, okay. And now we have the logical reason, that there's no logical reason for a fire not to be lit. Now you have to go into mystical explanations. So those are 4 reasons. Okay, I'm going to give more reasons if I can think of them. What was the other reason? It escaped me again. 1 second. Yes. Then we have the empirical reason, right? We saw that in Numbers 15. We have the Mikosheshet Tzim. We have the gatherer of the of wood, right? And he's not put to death for lighting a fire. He's put to death for doing milakha. That's associated with lighting a fire, for gathering the wood on the Shabbat. Okay, and on top of it, okay, we know that when the prophets, or in case of Nehemiah, when the prophets and leaders of Israel excoriate the nation for violating the Shabbat, they never say, why do you have a fire burning in your house on Shabbat? They never say that. They wouldn't be so stupid as to say that. It doesn't make sense. They say, why did you do work? Why are you going in and out of the gates with heavy loads? Why are you doing business on Shabbat? That's what they're concerned about. So those are 5 reasons right there where it wouldn't make sense that the lighting of a fire in and of itself per se is somehow restricted on the Shabbat. Okay, so the Egyptian Karaites are dead wrong. The Rabbinites are a little bit better, but they're wrong. and I think that this is the proper interpretation. So again, if I were to translate this verse, it would be: do not do any milacha associated with having a fire burn. Let me say this differently: do not do any milacha, do not do any work associated with kindling a fire on the Shabbat day in your habitations. Okay, so no going out and gathering the wood, no starting the fire from scratch, which is a lot of work, no chopping the wood. Everything should be set up in advance. The fire should be going, and then you just toss a log on every hour or two, no problem. Okay, but you can certainly drive a car on Shabbat, because that doesn't require any milacha, doesn't require hard work. In fact, I give an argument for the fact that it will save a lot of work. Right? Think of the Karaite dressed in his winter Polish garb, walking through the hills of Jerusalem in 95-degree weather, etc. So there are many times where lighting a fire will actually save work rather than cause work. So that's my take on Exodus 35:3. Maybe we'll look at some of the commentators. Let's see what Robert Alter has to say. We already read his thing. Okay. So he says this prohibition is a new specification. The lighting of fires might well be associated with the tasks involved in constructing the tabernacle, because fire would have been required for all the metal work. And one, okay, we read this already. So he doesn't really, well, he kind of does touch on it here, but the kindling of fire as against merely making use of fire that has been set accidentally is clearly a primary labor of civilization. So as the Prometheus myth suggests, a kind of inauguration of technology. And so it's understandable that a special prohibition of it on the Shabbat should be spelled out. So he's kind of approaching what I'm saying, but kind of he's basically saying that lighting a fire is a symbolic act of technology. So he's not really saying exactly what I'm saying. All right, let's see what we want to try to do. Some new commentaries. So as I mentioned last week, let's take a look at a number of commentaries, and I'm going to end the morning study. This has been a good study. So let's see here. Oh, how do we do this? I think we have to go to sermons. No, I don't want sermons. Comments? Like this, commentaries? Yeah. So, this is 35:3. Let's look at some random commentaries. So here's some commentaries. I've never heard of half of these commentaries, but let's go through them and see what we have. Okay. So you've got the Benson commentary, whatever the heck that is. Shall kindle no fire for any servile work throughout your habitations. No, not for the service of the tabernacle, as for the heating of tools, or the melting of metals, or other things belonging to it, which being made for God's service and deserving and requiring all expedition, they might probably conceive that such a work might be done on that day. And here also, as often elsewhere, under one kind of work, lighting a fire, blah, blah. And here also, as often elsewhere, under one kind of work, lighting a fire, every other kind is comprehended and forbidden. Is justly observed by Mr. Scott here. If the kindling of fires in general on these Shabbat days be here understood to be prohibited, it must either be viewed as a mere temporary institution to continue only during the time when the people were miraculously provided for in the wilderness, or that some exceptions were allowed in favor of the sick, infirm, and children, who must suffer extremely at some seasons, even in warm climates, for want of fire. And that's another good point, right? What about sick people? What about, elderly and sick and little babies, right? So now it becomes not just uncomfortable on the Shabbat, it becomes downright dangerous. Or that a fire which was burning might be kept up, though a fresh one might not be kindled. Here we go. So this person agrees exactly with me. How about that? It is remarkable that the subsequent parts of the scripture give no light on the subject. Further than that, among the various instances recorded of Israelites being reproved and individuals punished for neglecting to sanctify the Shabbat, this is not once mentioned. Again, exactly what I said. The modern Jews understand the prohibition literally, yet they use fires in various ways on the Shabbat, but employ other persons to kindle them or keep them. This is basically exactly what I was saying, right? Let's read this commentary again and try to analyze it a bit more. So this guy, whoever he is, makes sense. I like this guy. What's his name? Benson commentary? I have no idea what it is. All right. So you shall kindle no fire for any servile work. I'm not sure what he means by any servile work. I think he means, I'm not sure what he means by that. So I won't even try the interpretation. Throughout your habitations, no, not for the service of the tabernacle, as for the heating of tools or the melting of metals or other things belonging to it, which being made for God's service and deserving and requiring all expedition, they might probably conceive that such work might be done upon that day. I'm not sure exactly what he's saying there either, to be quite honest. And I don't want to belabor it, so we're going to go on. And here also, as often elsewhere, under one kind of work, lighting a fire, every other kind is comprehended and forbidden. So he's saying here exactly what I said, that this is a representation. This is an example. And this is another thing that should be pointed out, right? That often you have examples representing the whole. This happens very often in the Torah. So here, right, this don't light a fire on the Shabbat day is an example, maybe a primary example of work that might be done, but really it's just an example that represents all work that is not to be done. So that's another point. Okay, it is justly observed by Mr. Scott, whoever that is here. Here, if the kindling of fires in general on the Shabbat days be understood to be prohibited, it must be either viewed as a mere temporary institution to continue only during the time when the people were miraculously provided for in the wilderness, or that some exceptions were allowed in favor of the sick, the infirm, and the children who must suffer extremely. So this is what we call the common sense argument. Okay, you're going even further than I went. Right? It's not just uncomfortable; it's downright dangerous for people who might be sick or old or little children. Okay. For want of a fire, or that a fire which was burning might be kept up, though a fresh one might not be kindled. And again, this is exactly what I said. It does not take a lot of work to toss another log on the fire, but it takes a lot of work to kindle one from scratch. It is remarkable that the subsequent parts of the scripture give no light on the subject. That's exactly what we said before. Nowhere else in the entire Tanakh is ever mentioned this prohibition. In the entire, not the Torah, in the entire Tanakh is ever mentioned this prohibition against lighting a fire on the Shabbat. Okay? That among the various instances recorded, the Israelites being reproved and individuals punished for neglecting to sanctify the Shabbat, this one is not once mentioned. That's what we said in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah speaks about violating the Shabbat. Why have you violated my Shabbat? And Nehemiah, the same thing. Never mentioned this. The modern Jews understand the prohibition literally, yet they use fires in various ways on the Shabbat. So here's the hypocrisy, right? The modern Jews, the Haredim, the Orthodox, are being hypocritical, is basically what it's saying. And he's right? They can't live without fire. They just use loopholes like Shabbos goys to get around it, right? So the obvious implication is you can't live without fire on Shabbat, but employ other persons to kindle them or to keep them up. Okay. Let's look Matthew Henry's concise commentary, The Mild and Easy Yoke of Christ has made our Shabbat duties and what the heck? Well, okay, we'll skip that one. Okay. Let's see if we can get anything out of this Christian commentary. No, that's just more preaching than. This prohibition is here first distinctly expressed, but is implied in Exodus 16:23. Let's look at Exodus 16:23. I'm curious to see that. So, okay, so this is right. So this is referring to the manna, right? Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. So whatever left, and keep it. Save whatever is left and keep it until the morning. So what he's saying is that this implies that no fire, there was no baking and boiling that was supposed to happen on the Shabbat. But I don't think that makes sense. It's an interesting point, actually. I'll have to think about that more, that maybe this somehow implies it, but I don't think so. I think what it's saying is don't do the work of baking and boiling on Shabbat. But that's the first time I ever heard that. That's an interesting point. Matthew Poole's commentary. The command seems to be only temporary and extraordinary during the present season and condition and not extending for succeeding generations. 4, there are instances of temporary precepts both in the Old and New Testament, forget the New Testament, which yet are not in their places said to be so. Such were some of the precepts concerning the Passover, Exodus 12:11, that's true. As is confessed, as such was the law of abstaining from things strangled and blood. That's New Testament, we'll skip that. This precept is nakedly proposed and not called a perpetual statute, nor enjoined to be observed in the generations as other precepts are, to whom those or some like clauses are frequently added. So that's a good point. It never says, it says here L'chol moshvotechem, but it never says l'chol dorotechem. It doesn't say throughout your generations. So I think he's going with the idea that this is temporary. Okay. The Shabbat is rather a feast day than a fast day, and the Jews did make feasts and invited guests upon the Shabbat day, which could not probably be without kindling a fire, and which is more considerable. Okay, now we get into Christian stuff, but we'll just read it. Christ himself fulfilled all the blah, 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 therefore not. Okay, forget that. Irrelevant. Okay, reason 4, the kindling of fire was no greater hindrance to religious observance of Shabbat than the other things which were allowed on the day, such as the washing and dressing of themselves, eating and drinking. Right. So this is now basically what I call the hypocritical argument, right? That you're doing. I forgot what I called it. I should write all of these arguments down. But you're doing milacha on Shabbat anyway. You have to set the table. You have to clear the table, etc. This prohibition does not seem to concern the dressing of meat, as many understand it, by comparing this with Exodus 16:23. Which place I humbly conceive I misunderstood, as I have there intimated, for that was lawful to be done upon their most solemn days, but the service of the tabernacle. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Again, this guy goes with the idea that it's temporary. We'll continue this later, I think. Let's look at one more. Maybe we'll go through some of these commentators later. Again, he's saying it's applied in Exodus 16:23. I'm not sure I agree with that. Pulpit's commentary, the kindling of fire in early times involved considerable labor. That's exactly what I was saying. It was the ordinarily effected by rubbing 2 sticks together or twisting one round rapidly between the 2 palms in a depression upon a board. Fire only came after a long time. Moreover, as in the warm climate of Arabia and Palestine, artificial warmth was not needed. Not true, by the way. Fire could only have been kindled there for cooking purposes, which involved further unnecessary work, and had already been forgiven. The Karaite Jews still maintain that. Karaite Jews still maintain the observance of this precept to the letter, even in cold climates as in that of the Crimea, and allow neither fire nor light in their houses on the Shabbat day. But the Jews generally view the precept of having had only temporary force and have lights and fires like other persons, even in Palestine. Strict Jews, however, still cook no food on Shabbat day. Okay. Preliminaries to the work. After the restoration of the covenant, Moses announced to the people the divine commandments with reference to the holy place of the tabernacle. Okay, let's look at one more. Let's look at Ibn Ezra on Exodus 35:2. I hope I've made sense in all of these explanations. I'll try to continue them this afternoon. Okay, so let's look at Ibn Ezra. Tanakh. So here are more rabbinical commentators, but I'm going to focus on the Ibn Ezra because he is Karaite leaning. So Exodus 35. There we go. לא תבערו בעבור שהזכיר ביום הראשון ובשביעי בחג המצות כל מלאכה לא יעשה בהם להתיר אוכל נפש. אמר עתה בשבת לא תבערו אש לאפות לחם ולבשל בשר, כי האש צורך לכל מאכל. בהגאון הרב סעדיה חיבר ספר נכבד, תשובות על החולקים על קדמוננו al ner Shabbat. So, what is he saying here? בעבור שהזכיר ביום הראשון ובשביעי בחג המצות כל מלאכה לא יעשה בהם להתיר אוכל שבת נפש. So he's saying, this is to distinguish from when we're talking about Chag HaMatzot, where it says that you're not supposed to do any melacha except for the preparation of food, okay? And then it says explicitly, okay? In Exodus 12:16, as we see down here. Okay. So now he's saying, but this is now a distinction because on the Shabbat, okay, you should not kindle a fire because you don't need to bake bread or even to bake bread or to cook meat, right? because fire is needed for all food. So basically, I think what he's saying here is that the reason you're not supposed to have a fire burning is that you're not allowed, you don't have this heter, you don't have this exception which you have on on the first and seventh day of Chag HaMatzot, that you're allowed to make food. On Shabbat, you're not allowed to prepare food, okay? And therefore you don't need fire. That's basically what he's saying. Gaon Rav Saadia Chiber Sefer Nichbad. So Saadia Gaon, this is Al-Fayumi, which they call the Saadia Gaon. Haver Sefer Nichbad, he put together an honorable book, Chuvot al Chorkim al Kadmonena al Ner Shabbat, on those who disagree with our forefathers regarding the lighting of the Shabbat candle. Okay. So I think he's referring to Saadia Gaon's refutation of the Karaites, actually. Okay, and there's a reference here. Let's see if we can get to that. The references to the Karaites who prohibit a candle that is lit before the onset of the Sabbath from continuing to burn the Shabbat. Right. So there we go. And here that is permitted. Right. Okay. So I think the Ibn Ezra really doesn't give us anything new here. Basically, all he says that the reason that fire is forbidden on Shabbat, there's Lavi, by the way, it's in the backyard if you're looking from. The reason that fire is forbidden on Shabbat is because there's no exception, as there is on the first and seventh day of Chag HaMatzot, of Passover, where you're allowed to make food on the first and seventh day. I think that's kind of circular reasoning. Because I would say that the reason that you're allowed to make food on the first and seventh day of Shabbat is because there's no restriction against lighting a fire. I'm not expressing that well. I have to think it out more myself. But there's some kind of circular reasoning going on here. I promise you there is. At any rate, let's leave it at that. I think we'll pick it up this afternoon. Maybe I will add another tab here. No, I'm going to do this differently. Let's get rid of this. No, do it this way. So let's call it 1 second. Exodus 35:3 reasons, and and what do we want to say here? We want to say, we want to call this reasons to understand Exodus 35:3, reasons not to understand Exodus 35:3 as a prohibition against fire per se. Okay, good enough. So we'll give it each reason a name and an explanation. Get rid of this. Get rid of this. Send this out to here. And now we're good to go. So the first one is, we said, we called it the grammatical reason. Okay? That being that the result is often substituted for the cause in biblical Hebrew. see Exodus 36:7. And I'll have to get the official name for that grammatical. My battery's about to go dead, but we have a couple minutes. See Exodus 36:7. Okay. Next reason, we called it the common sense reason. Okay, Shabbat would be extremely, or would be unpleasant, and even dangerous to the sick, firm, and children, and small children, without fire. Fire, even in the land of Israel. Okay, so that's the common sense reason. Then we said the logical reason. No, then we said the occurrence reason. The of Shabbat appear many times in the Torah. And references to its, and never is a prohibition against fire mentioned aside from this verse. In addition, in the rest of the Tanakh, it is never mentioned. That's the occurrence reason. Then we have the logical reason. Logical reason is there is no logical explanation for prohibiting fire per se on the Shabbat. So one is left only to come up with mystical explanations, thereby turning the Torah into a book of mysticism. I won't put that extra commentary in that again. So there's no logical explanation, right? Next, we can have the hypocritical reason. Hypocritical. Okay? Rabbinites still use fire on Shabbat. Shabbos Goy. Shabbos Goy. They still do work such as clearing table. They even do hard work such as walking for an hour, working for long periods of time in the summer heat. So that's the hypocritical explanation. And is that all of them? That might be all of them. I can't think of anything more right now. I'll probably come up with others later. So 5 reasons why Exodus 35:3 is not a per se prohibition against lighting fire on Shabbat. Okay, we're going to leave it at that for this morning's study. I hope you all enjoyed it. Lot to say here, a bit complicated. We'll pick it up this afternoon. And in the meantime, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.